"Who was the first bride who came to this house, Captain Jim?" and asked as they sat around the fireplace after dinner. "Was she part of the story I've heard about this house?" asked Gilbert. "Someone told me you could tell it, Captain Jim." "Well, yes, I know it. I think I'm the only person living in Four Winds now who remembers the schoolmaster's bride when she came to the island. She died 30 years ago, but she was one of those women you never forget." "Tell us the story," and asked, "I want to learn about the women who have lived in this house before me." "Well, there have only been 3, Elizabeth Russell and Mrs. Ned Russell and the schoolmaster's bride. Elizabeth Russell was a nice, clever little person, and Mrs. Ned was a nice woman, too. But they were never like the schoolmaster's bride. The schoolmaster's name was John Selwyn. He came from the old country to teach school at the Glen when I was a boy of 16. He wasn't like the usual men who used to come to PI to teach school in those days. Most of them were clever, but often drank too much. They taught the children reading, writing, and arithmetic when they were sober and hit them when they weren't. But John Selwyn was a fine, handsome young man. He stayed at my father's house, and he and I were good friends, even though he was 10 years older than me. We read, walked, and talked a lot together. He knew about all the poetry that was ever written, I think, and he used to read it to me along the shore in the evenings. Dad thought it was a waste of time, but he allowed it, hoping it would make me stop wanting to go to sea. Well, nothing could stop that. My mother came from a family of sailors, and it was in me. But I loved to hear John read and recite. It's almost 60 years ago, but I could still recite lots of poetry I learned from him. Nearly 60 years. Captain Jim was silent for a while, looking into the glowing fire, thinking of the past. Then, with a sigh, he continued his story. "I remember one spring evening I met him on the sandhills. He looked happy, just like you did, Dr. Blythe, when you brought Mistress Blythe in tonight. I thought of him the minute I saw you. And he told me that he had a sweetheart back home and that she was coming to him. I wasn't very happy, selfish young boy that I was. I thought he wouldn't be as much my friend after she came. But I was decent enough not to let him see it. He told me all about her. Her name was Persis-Lee, and she would have come with him if it hadn't been for her old uncle. He was sick, and he had taken care of her when her parents died, and she wouldn't leave him. And now he was dead, and she was coming to marry John Selwyn. It wasn't an easy journey for a woman in those days. There were no steamships, you know. When do you expect her?" I asked. "She sails on the Royal William, the 20th of June," he said, "and so she should be here by mid-July. I must ask Carpenter Johnson to build me a home for her. Her letter came today. I knew before I opened it that it had good news for me. I saw her a few nights ago. I didn't understand him, and then he explained, though I didn't understand that much better. He said he had a gift, or a curse. Those were his words, Mistress Blythe, a gift or a curse. He didn't know which it was. He said a great-great-grandmother of his had it, and they burned her for a witch because of it. He said strange spells, trances, I think was the name he gave them, came over him now and then." "Are there such things, Doctor?" "There are people who certainly have trances," answered Gilbert. "This is more about studying the mind than medicine. What were John Selwyn's trances like? Like dreams, said the old doctor skeptically. He said he could see things in them, said Captain Jim slowly. Remember, I'm just telling you what he said. Things that were happening, things that were going to happen. He said sometimes they made him happy and sometimes they scared him. For nights before this, he had a trance while he was sitting looking at the fire. And he saw an old room he knew well in England, and Persisley was in it, holding out her hands to him and looking glad and happy. So he knew he was going to hear good news from her. A dream, said the old doctor, not believing. Maybe, agreed Captain Jim. That's what I said to him at the time. It was much more comfortable to think so. I didn't like the idea of him seeing things like that. It was really strange. No, he said, I didn't dream it. But we won't talk about this again. You won't be as much my friend if you think too much about it. I told him nothing could make me less his friend. But he just shook his head and said, Lad, I know. I've lost friends before because of this. I don't blame them. There are times when I hardly feel friendly to myself because of it. Such a power has a bit of divinity in it, whether of a good or an evil divinity who shall say. And we mortals all shrink from too close contact with God or the devil. Those were his words. I remember them as if it was yesterday, though I didn't know exactly what he meant. What do you think he did mean, Doctor? I doubt if he knew what he meant himself, said Dr. Dave grumpily. I think I understand, whispered Anne. She was listening with her lips pressed together and her eyes shining. Captain Jim gave her an admiring smile before he went on with his story. Well, soon all the people in Glen and Four Winds knew the schoolmaster's bride was coming, and they were all glad because they liked him so much. And everybody took an interest in his new house, this house. He chose this place for it because you could see the harbor and hear the sea from it. He made the garden out there for his bride, but he didn't plant the Lombardy poplar trees. Mrs. Ned Russell planted them. But there's a double row of rose bushes in the garden that the little girls who went to the Glen School planted for the schoolmaster's bride. He said they were pink for her cheeks and white for her forehead and red for her lips. He had quoted poetry so much that he sort of got into the habit of talking it, too, I think. Almost everybody sent him a little present to help with the furniture for the house. When the Russells moved in, they were well-to-do and furnished it nicely, as you can see, but the first furniture that went into it was plain. This little house was rich in love, though. The women sent in quilts and tablecloths and towels, and one man made a chest for her, and another a table, and so on. Even blind old Aunt Margaret Boyd wove a little basket for her out of the sweet-smelling sandhill grass. The schoolmaster's wife used it for years to keep her handkerchiefs in. Well, at last everything was ready, even the logs in the big fireplace ready for lighting. It wasn't exactly this fireplace, though it was in the same place. Miss Elizabeth had this put in when she remodeled the house 15 years ago. It was a big, old-fashioned fireplace where you could have roasted an ox. Many times I've sat here and told stories, just like I'm doing tonight. Again there was a silence, while Captain Jim thought of the people and Gilbert could not see, the folks who had sat with him around that fireplace in the past years, with happiness and bridal joy shining in eyes long since closed forever under churchyard soil or deep sea. Here on old nights children had tossed laughter back and forth. Here on winter evenings friends had gathered. Dance and music and jokes had been here. Here young men and women had dreamed. For Captain Jim, the little house was filled with shapes asking for remembrance. It was the 1st of July when the house was finished. The schoolmaster began to count the days then. We used to see him walking along the shore, and we'd say to each other, "She'll soon be with him now." She was expected in the middle of July, but she didn't come then. Nobody felt worried. Ships were often delayed for days and maybe weeks. The Royal William was a week late, and then 2, and then 3. And at last we began to be scared, and it got worse and worse. Finally, I couldn't bear to look into John Selwyn's eyes. "Do you know, Mistress Blythe," Captain Jim lowered his voice, "I used to think that they looked just like what his old great-great-grandmothers must have been when they were burning her to death." He never said much, but he taught school like a man in a dream and then hurried to the shore. Many nights he walked there from dark to dawn. People said he was losing his mind. Everybody had given up hope. The Royal William was 8 weeks late. It was the middle of September and the schoolmaster's bride hadn't come, never would come, we thought. There was a big storm then that lasted 3 days, and on the evening after it ended I went to the shore. I found the schoolmaster there, leaning with his arms folded against a big rock, looking out to sea. I spoke to him, but he didn't answer. His eyes seemed to be looking at something I couldn't see. His face was set like a dead man's. "John, John," I called out, just like that, just like a scared child. "Wake up, wake up." That strange, awful look seemed to sort of fade out of his eyes. He turned his head and looked at me. I've never forgotten his face, never will forget it till I go on my last journey. "All is well, lad," he said. "I've seen the Royal William coming around East Point. She will be here by dawn. Tomorrow night I shall sit with my bride by my own fireplace." "Do you think he did see it?" asked Captain Jim suddenly. "God knows," said Gilbert softly. "Great love and great pain might make things happen that we can't explain." "I am sure he did see it," said and earnestly. "Nonsense," said Dr. Dave, but he spoke with less certainty than usual. "Because, you know," said Captain Jim seriously, "the Royal William came into Four Winds Harbor at daylight the next morning. Every soul in the glen and along the shore was at the old wharf to meet her. The schoolmaster had been watching there all night. How we cheered as she sailed up the channel." Captain Jim's eyes were shining. They were looking at the Four Winds Harbor of 60 years ago, with an old ship sailing through the sunrise light. "And Persisley was on board?" asked Anne. "Yes, her and the captain's wife. They'd had a terrible journey, storm after storm, and their food ran out, too. But there they were at last. When Persisley stepped onto the old wharf, John Selwyn took her in his arms, and folks stopped cheering and began to cry. I cried myself, though it was years before I'd admit it. Isn't it funny how ashamed boys are of tears?" "Was Persisley beautiful?" asked Anne. "Well, I don't know if you'd call her beautiful exactly. I don't know," said Captain Jim slowly. "Somehow, you never wondered if she was pretty or not. It just didn't matter. There was something so sweet and charming about her that you had to love her, that was all. But she was nice to look at, big, clear, hazel eyes and lots of shiny brown hair and a fair English skin. John and she were married at our house that night at early candle lighting. Everybody from far and near was there to see it, and we all brought them down here afterwards. Mistress Selwyn lit the fire, and we went away and left them sitting here, just as John had seen in his vision. A strange thing, a strange thing. But I've seen a lot of strange things in my time. Captain Jim shook his head wisely. It's a lovely story, said Anne, feeling that she finally had enough romance to make her happy. How long did they live here? 15 years. I went off to sea soon after they were married, like the young rascal I was. But every time I came back from a trip, I'd come here first, even before going home, and tell Mistress Selwyn all about it. 15 happy years. They were very good at being happy, those two. Some folks are like that, if you've noticed. They couldn't stay unhappy for long, no matter what happened. They argued once or twice, for they were both lively. But Mistress Selwyn said to me once, laughing in that pretty way of hers, I felt awful when John and I argued, but deep down I was very happy because I had such a nice husband to argue with and make up with. Then they moved to Charlottetown, and Ned Russell bought this house and brought his bride here. They were a happy young pair, as I remember them. Miss Elizabeth Russell was Alec's sister. She came to live with them a year or so later, and she was always cheerful, too. The walls of this house must be full of laughter and good times. You're the third bride I've seen come here, Mistress Blythe, and the prettiest. Captain Jim managed to give his compliments so nicely and felt proud. She was looking her best that night, with a rosy glow on her cheeks and the love light in her eyes. Even grumpy old Dr. Dave gave her an approving look and told his wife, as they drove home together, that red-headed wife of the boys was quite a beauty. I must be getting back to the lighthouse, announced Captain Jim. I've enjoyed this evening a lot. You must come often to see us, said Anne. I wonder if you'd give that invitation if you knew how likely I'll be to accept it, Captain Jim said with a smile. Which is another way of saying you wonder if I mean it, smiled Anne. I do, cross my heart, as we used to say at school. Then I'll come. You're likely to see me at any hour. And I'll be proud to have you visit me now and then, too. Usually, I haven't anyone to talk to but the first mate, bless his friendly heart. He's a great listener, and he knows a lot, but he isn't much of a talker. You're young and I'm old, but our souls are about the same age, I think. We both belong to the race that knows Joseph, as Cornelia Bryant would say. The race that knows Joseph? Asked Anne, puzzled. Yes. Cornelia divides all the people in the world into two kinds, the race that knows Joseph and the race that doesn't. If a person sees things the way you do, and has pretty much the same ideas about things, and the same taste in jokes, well, then he belongs to the race that knows Joseph. Oh, I understand, exclaimed Anne as she figured it out. It's what I used to call, and still call in quotation marks, kindred spirits. Exactly, agreed Captain Jim. We're it, whatever it is. When you came in tonight, Mistress Blythe, I said to myself, yes, she's of the race that knows Joseph. And I was very glad, for if it wasn't so we couldn't have had any real fun together. The race that knows Joseph is the best kind of people, I think. The moon had just risen when Anne and Gilbert went to the door with their guests. For Winds Harbor was starting to look like a dream, a magical place where no storm could ever come. The tall Lombardy trees down the lane, dark and serious like a group of priests, were tipped with silver. "I've always liked Lombardis," said Captain Jim, waving a long arm at them. "They're the trees of princesses. They're not in fashion now. Folks say they die at the top and look messy. So they do, if you don't climb up every spring to trim them. I always did it for Miss Elizabeth, so her Lombardis never looked bad. She loved them. She liked their dignity. They don't mix with every Tom, Dick, and Harry. If it's maples for company, Mistress Blythe, it's Lombardis for special friends." "What a beautiful night," said Mrs. Dr. Dave, as she climbed into the doctor's buggy. "Most nights are beautiful," said Captain Jim. "But I think that moonlight over Four Winds makes me wonder what's left for heaven." "The moon's a great friend of mine, Mistress Blythe. I've loved her ever since I can remember. When I was a little boy of 8, I fell asleep in the garden one evening and wasn't missed. I woke up later in the night and I was almost scared to death. What shadows and strange noises there were. I didn't dare move. I just crouched there shaking, poor little thing. It seemed like there wasn't anyone in the world but me, and it was very big. Then all at once I saw the moon looking down at me through the apple tree branches, just like an old friend. I was comforted right away. Got up and walked to the house as brave as a lion, looking at her. Many nights I've watched her from the deck of my ship, on seas far away from here. Why don't you folks tell me to stop talking and go home?" The laughter of the good nights faded away. Anne and Gilbert walked hand in hand around their garden. The brook that ran across the corner sparkled in the shadows of the birch trees. The poppies along its banks were like small cups of moonlight. Flowers that had been planted by the hands of the schoolmaster's bride filled the air with their sweet smell, like the beauty and blessing of past days. Anne stopped in the dark to gather a flower. "I love to smell flowers in the dark," she said. "You get hold of their soul then." "Oh, Gilbert, this little house is everything I dreamed it would be. And I'm so glad that we are not the first who have kept bridal promises here.